Well, I cannot start without saying thank you to Dr. Lisa Boleg. She's right. We have known each other for going on 10 years now, I think eight and counting. And before I met her in person, I was a fan of her work and was just, I fell in love with an article she published in Sex Roles and had quoted it a lot of times. And then I can't remember if we were staying at the same hotel for that conference or what, but I was just like, if there's one person I need to meet at this conference, it's Lisa Boleg. So thank you so much for the generous introduction, but also just the ability to be in community with you all. So the answer to the question that you posed to me, I do have some kind of comments that I started to put together this morning during my writing time. But again, happy to have the rest of the time really be about an exchange and, really trying to think through a lot of these things in community together. Because I think that's really one of the things that is going to be important to us as we think about kind of the title of this salon for today, right? In terms of what now and how do we conduct intersectionality research in an era, and I am calling it an era, not a 4-year presidential term, an era of retrenchment. Because I think this is certainly something that predates what happened on November 5th, 2024. And I think this is something that is going to last after January 21st in 2029. So I think we want to kind of think of it in those terms, but also think of it in those terms without getting overwhelmed by those terms. And so hopefully some of the things I'm going to share can kind of speak to this moment. So I think the first thing I want to do is to kind of define why I'm talking about it as a time or an era of retrenchment, as opposed to period. Brittany Cooper, very prominent Black feminist theorist, is talking about this as a period of resegregation. Certainly, there's the word fascism that has been used repeatedly. And so when I'm using the word retrenchment, I'm really talking not just from an academic perspective, but from a lived experience perspective of policy retrenchments, right? And so policy retrenchments really consist of this actual scaling back of policies and protections for communities. And I think it's important to think about both of those. There are the policies piece, right? So you think about what's going on at NIH, what's going on at CDC, what's going on at NSF, and a host of other kind of alphabet soup of organizations at the federal level. But also you can think about the stripping back at the state level primarily, but again, trickling into the federal level of the protections that have been afforded to many, many communities, right? And so I'm going to talk a smidge about that, but I think we can have much more conversation about that. So retrenchment includes both of those components. There are the policy rollbacks, can't say this, can't say that. And then there are the protections that are being stripped from communities at the same time, and maybe even folks on this call, right? So I think we want to honor that space, that this is not just something that's out there, that's, folks who are not us, it also is us in many ways. The reason I pointed out those three terms is because they're conceptually distinct, but they're not mutually exclusive. So I think I'm talking about retrenchment, but resegregation primarily centers racial retrenchment, again, because again, in the US context and in the European and North American context, when we talked about segregation, it has primarily been around the concept of race and ethnicity. Of course, we are all here for the purpose, and we affirm that, while that is an incredibly critical part of what intersectionality is, it is not all of what intersectionality is. So that's why I'm not using the term resegregation in this conversation. The other thing, when we think about fascism, fascism is, again, political scientist here, is a very specific term, right, that refers to an ideology-driven, authoritarian, nationalistic, right-wing system of government and social organization, right? And so again, activists and other folks may use it in certain ways, but I'm distinguishing retrenchment from fascism under that definition, right? So could there be fascist retrenchment? Yes, absolutely. So I want to say that they're not mutually exclusive. I think we are looking at, and what I'm grappling with, are things that we are seeing enacted daily through both executive orders as well as what I would consider and define as extra legal methods, right? So everything Elon Musk and his folks are doing is policy retrenchment. And so, there are a couple of big challenges with policy retrenchment. I think from the human perspective, there's a deep sense of loss and grief that needs to be processed about that. Because the twofold challenge is none of these policies were enacted easily or breezily, I like to say, right? These are not things that, were just kind of, oh yeah, today let's put this policy in place to protect communities, right? And so the example I thought of this morning is I remember being in college 35 years ago and participating in ACT UP demonstrations, right? To make sure that, there was special attention paid to the fact that folks in the LGBTQI plus community were dying of a disease and there was no government intervention and interaction, to really figure out what was going on and how we could not just protect communities, although that was a really important component of it, but also use academic research to understand the mechanisms by which this disease was spreading. So public health epidemiological strategies, as well as some of the medical advances that we now know exist today, right? That was activism that brought that apart, brought that together. And it was not just activism on the ACT UP side, there was definitely an inside-outside game that took place, right? With folks inside the government, at the NIH, at the CDC, at NIH, NIAID, sorry, the National Institute for Allergens and Infectious Diseases, right? Which, fun fact, for those of you who don't follow a lot of NIAID, that is actually the institute run by Dr. Anthony Fauci, right? And so again, some of these attacks serve dual political purposes, right? It serves to delegitimize certainly Dr. Fauci and the role that he took standing up, right? When in the face of the COVID pandemic, another infectious disease, of course, but it has this ripple effect on all of these areas of research, which may or may not be part of the net that they are trying to cast, right, in terms of policy retrenchment. The 4 questions to consider, and then one really important mantra to remember is, I think we want to think today and in community as we continue in this work, how do we empower our research, right? I thought about turbocharge, but I really like the word empower our research. How do we empower the communities that we are a part of, right? Because again, this is not those out there who are experiencing this. This is us. We are experiencing this, right? And we're experiencing it, yes, as academics or yes, as people who do research, but we're also experiencing it as human beings in our bodies, right? Experiencing this moment where our bodies are being delegitimized. Our bodies are very much trying to get erased. They're trying to erase us, for lack of a better way of saying it. Third question is, how do we empower the communities we stand in solidarity with, but are not a part of? And then the fourth question is, how do we empower ourselves, right? So we can think of ourselves as parts of a community, but also we are individuals, right? With our own set of needs and positionalities that we really want to take into account. The mantra I think we need to repeat and to, make sure that we really internalize and embrace is that we cannot answer all 4 of those questions simultaneously for a sustained period of time. We are going to have to individually and communally start to think about, where can I do 1 of those questions or 2 of those questions for a period of time, and where can I trust and engage with others to work on the other questions that I'm not at a bandwidth where I can do all of them, right? And I think this is true as a matter of self-care, but also as a matter of communal care, right? Because we've all been stretched thin and we're all going through a trauma. And so I think we want to think about the fact that we cannot do it all, as if we ever could, but we especially cannot do it all and expect to survive and thrive. And I think part of this is about survival and thrival as a mechanism for resistance, as much as it is, personal triumph or, wanting to be whoever we've aspired to be in our lives, to everybody that's in our lives. So how do we deal with this? I think we build community at a level of profound humanity. And I mean by profound humanity, we do that community building offline, especially. And I don't mean that just for the purposes of we hate technology. I'm as addicted to technology as anyone. But I think, part of responding and resisting dehumanization is to rehumanize, right? And so we rehumanize as a form of resistance, and we do that in person, in community with each other. So we do want to leverage the power of technology. And so I'm really informed here by a lot of the critical disability study literature, right? And making sure that we're using technology as a way to support those who are isolated or unable to connect in person for whatever reason, right? And that can, of course, be temporal. Nobody wants to connect with somebody who may have, COVID, for example, right? So we want to leverage their ability to connect and be part of the community. But also, this may be a much more long-term kind of thing, right? If you think about certain kinds of chronic things that folks might be contending with or dealing with. We also can think about that geographically, right? I know at least, again, being informed by the work that I've done in LGBTQ plus communities, right? Not everyone is located in an urban center or a college campus where it is quote unquote easy to be a member of that community, right? And so again, you can leverage technology as an important kind of intervention in all kinds of things, anything from, unaliving to a whole host of other kinds of interventions. So last and finally, and I know I've said that 4 times, but this is truly the last thing. We participate in community by also participating in communal self-care. And so I think, to some of the quote unquote, house rules of today's conversation and moving forward, we will not all find the same self-care practices restorative. But I do think we can think about a different kind of rest beyond just physical or psychological rest. And so there's a book by Sandra Dalton Smith called Sacred Rest, which is a spiritual book as much as it is a medical book. But she talks about several different kinds of rest. So I'm just going to list those. And the kinds she talks about are physical, emotional, spiritual, creative, interpersonal or social rest. And that can be for introverts and extroverts alike, right? Not just introverts need social rest, and mental rest. And so mental being different from emotional because it's more about intellectual rest, right? Like resting your brain from the number of decisions that you have to make in a day, right? Or giving yourself the intellectual rest of being able to read for pleasure as opposed to read for research or read for understanding what's going on in the world. We haven't talked about as much. I certainly have not seen it in the media, but I think we want to lift it up, is as much as this is an ideological, we don't like trans people, we think that feminists have gone too far, we don't want certain communities, of color to have certain levels of access or protection. This is also and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I always like to say, but I'm not a coincidence theorist either. This is also, when it comes to the medical and public health side of things, a huge corporate boondoggle. This is going to result in, right, the only quote unquote available research being corporate driven research with very few guardrails, with very few boundaries, right, without some of the protections of academic science and academic medicine, not just human subjects, but certainly some of the protections in terms of side effects we can think about if we're talking about medical kinds of interventions, that get tested and other kinds of things, and very limited legal protections for those who might be negatively impacted, right? But we could also think about just the very production of certain medicines and how, again, depending on what you're using in those medicines, they may, in fact, in mass production, cause huge environmental kinds of runoff, may have all kinds of other downstream effects, literally downstream effects, that are not necessarily protected because you're allowing corporations to kind of drive the scientific research, to cherry pick results, right? So when you start to attack the FDA, when you start to attack some of these other government agencies. And so I think that's something that I'm grappling with, but I also have not had community to really talk about because it's not being talked about as much as the other piece of it, right? I think about someone like who, again, we wouldn't necessarily count as an intersectionality theorist per se, but I think about just data as resistance and what we've observed even in the last 30 days, right? When, data sets were wiped from the CDC website, wiped from, scholars were like, no, it was almost like don't mess with the librarians at the National Archive a few years ago, right? When the current president decided he was going to take things that didn't belong to him, it was like, don't mess with the scientists because we will put that stuff right back up, right? As again, part of what it means to do this work, right? And even as we trouble the boundaries of what constitutes science, as being an inherently colonialist project for so many centuries, an inherently racist project, and a sexist project, homophobic project for so many centuries. We can also think about holding up where is data serving as resistance, right? Because I think that is the through line between what Anna Maria and Brandy were saying, right? And so just wanting to hold on to that piece when it's not funded. And I think about like not just somebody like a W.B. Du Bois or Dubois, depending on how you say it, who was collecting data about African Americans and Black people long before like he had tons of funding to do it, and was constantly running out of money, frankly, if you look at his life, to actually do the work. And constantly not being able to hold down a job because he didn't have a great personality, so folks didn't like him. But the other piece of that is I also think about somebody like Arthur Schomburg, right? Afro-Puerto Rican, right? Who, again, just was collecting and collecting and collecting and collecting, right? And on the side, right? And so again, I think those are some of those hidden strategies or fugitive strategies, if I want to, kind of think about a more critical approach to it, that we may want to start thinking about. What are our fugitive methodologies?
Academic journals or academics writing to other academics. And yes, it's necessary to get grants and all of that. But the communities that might benefit from the don't even have access to it because it's behind paywalls, as Paige said, or it's written in language that is totally inaccessible to regular people. And so I think, again, in terms of looking at what opportunities exist, I think there's an opportunity for people who do research to learn to be sort of to code switch. How do we write for an academic audience to keep our jobs, get the grants and all of that, but also write in ways to make sure that we are disseminating information in community with participants in the way they want it, ideally in their language, let them write it. I think, we really need to think about, because we're bounded by these gatekeepers, like who's funding it, how you write, how do the language you use, the language you don't use. And so this really is an opportunity for us to revisit stuff that we should have been doing long ago anyway. My
Yeah,
two cents.
I agree 100%. And I just wanted to bring in another friend of Lisa and mine, Olana Hankivsky. One of the things that she talks about a lot when she was doing some of her seminal work in Vancouver and BC, so Vancouver in Canada, not in Washington State, was really looking at what she defines as the gray literature, right? And so again, where are there pamphlets? Where are there articles? Where are there reports that are produced by nonprofit organizations or advocacy groups? Where are there videos? Where are there testimonies? Again, just thinking about all the different ways that people communicate about their knowledge, right? And sharing that. And that goes back to something, again, that was in one of the comments about not just saying that academic knowledge is the only kind of knowledge, but that, again, community expertise, lived experience have equal value. I think that's certainly part of the ethos of doing intersectionality research and intersectional research, but I think more to the point, like there may be even a greater need for that in terms of how we engage. And I would also, just as a last minute point, or last point, also think about it not just in terms of academic versus non-academic, but also think about English's linguistic dominance as well, right? So where can we also provide translational services or other kinds of things, again, for communities that speak in languages that are not English? We also want to think about whether we're incorporating it into the kinds of gray literature we talk about under Ilana's definition, or whether we're talking about how we then provide those services the way that we were just hearing about.
With my work in Kenya, when we share data back, it's not in what we would consider, like a traditional forum. We have open forums and discussions. We always have food. You got to have food.
Yeah.
And we really have people give testimonials too. That's been a really big part of some of our data feedback, is giving testimonials. And then we always give people, all the community organizations, access to the data and give them printouts with social demographic data, other things like that. Because it's not our data, it's their data. And so we make sure that we build in ways that we can share that information and that data with everyone. I think another thing that I think is really important too is, I've been doing this for a very long time. So, and even from the beginning, in my community work, we've always made sure that we are training folks in the community organizations how to do research and evaluation. And it was really based a lot in, a book, I think it was Fetterman wrote on empowerment evaluation years ago, and talked about how we should be partnering with communities and making sure they have the capacity to ask their own questions. So, back when I was a postdoc at UCSF, I was working with runaway and homeless youth, and we train them in research methods, and we train them in data collection and all these things. And they were often much better than we were at different aspects of design. And even some of our young folks who we thought weren't always paying attention. I remember one guy in a training, he was like, "Well, couldn't that be a confounding factor?" And I'm like, "Oh my God, you've been listening the whole time." And yeah, we're about to go to Kenya, and Lisa will be there as well. And we're training leaders of LGBT community organizations in research methodology, and then providing them with skills, mentoring, support, funds to ask their own research questions, conduct their own research study. And, it's going to be their questions. It's not about me, it's not about us, but it's about them, because then they can have those sustainable skills. And I think it's always important too to talk about both research and evaluation, because evaluation is often much more it's more capital for community orgs than research. They don't really care about, a lot of people don't care about the publications, but the monitoring evaluation keeps you funded and keeps you, to be able to write the grants and stuff like that.